In terms of the issues then, looking through it in general, the things that jumped out at me was the impacts on SPAs arising from loss of foraging or loafing or even just direct collision were all key issues that regularly cropped up and up again in terms of objections. It was quite interesting that in 7 cases, there was an initial objection from either SNH or Natural England on the grounds of insufficient information. So the whole thing had gone through EIA, had gone to application, got to inquiry, and at that time, prior to that, there was an initial objection. Now, in all cases, further information was subsequently provided at inquiry, and SNH and Natural England were able to remove their objection. But again, it comes back to whether you provided sufficient information to enable an appropriate level of assessment to be undertaken. And that's a common theme throughout. So although they went through and they got approved at appeal, a lot of the work that was done at the inquiry could have probably have been dealt with in advance if sufficient information and proper consultation had been picked up at an earlier stage. What was also quite telling was that regularly the inspectors were openly placing very great weight on the opinion of the relevant statutory agency, even in cases where there were remained objections from organisations as serious as the RSPB. Certainly in Scotland, the reporters there were giving very great weight to the opinions of the statutory agencies. There was an awful lot of use of conditions in relation to birds, particularly in relation to protection of breeding birds, a lot of conditions in relation to mitigation, compensation measures and monitoring as well. And there was still quite properly a reliance on collision risk modelling in terms of assessing risks. It's obviously in some cases, some of the objections were not considered to be at all serious by the inspectors, and in one passage, the inspector wrote, in relation to bird life, it was suggested that turbines are in effect giant killing machines which slay birds on a large scale. Whilst I respect the views of opponents of the wind farm, there is simply no evidence before me of any such effect is likely here. I do acknowledge that there are examples of bird kill elsewhere, but to suggest, as was the case here, that there would be slaughter on a massive scale at this wind farm is not supported by the evidence. You get a certain sense of irritation by the inspector in that particular case. The bat results were equally interesting in many ways. Of the 40 reports that I reviewed that made reference to bats, 35 were from England and only 4 from Scotland. So not the 50-50 that we had with birds, a very distinct issue in terms of England in relation to Scotland. And that very much reflected through in the comments and the seriousness which the inspectors were placing on bats between England and Scotland. 17 reports covered inquiries where bats were listed by the inspector as a main issue. 23 reports covered inquiries where bats were a secondary issue. Of the 20 appeals, 50% were dismissed and 50% were allowed. And of those that were dismissed, 2 or 10% concluded that issues relating to bats was a reason for a refusal, one in September 2009 and the other in September 2010, so relatively recent decisions, both in England. And in terms of those decisions, the issues in both cases, again, it's a familiar tale, insufficient survey or unreliable survey information that didn't give sufficient confidence to the inspector in the assessment that was being made by the case put forward for the appellant. And in both cases, Barbastelle bats were a key issue that clearly created a great sense of concern because of the rarity of the species. And I think that was the main issue. It seems to me, looking at both reports, there wasn't great evidence and concern over the collision element. It was just that you were dealing with a very rare bat. But in both cases, the level of survey effort was of great concern to the inspector. Legal protection is raised on a number of cases in relation to bats, reference to the Woolly judgments, reference to the European Habitats Directive, and interpretation of the law. One inquiry in northwest Scotland, northwest Cornwall, concentrated heavily on the legal protection, and the local authorities' argument was, well, having due regard to the habitats regulation, if you kill a single bat, then we are duty-bound to refuse this planning application, which was an interesting debate because it then led on to, well, in that case, do you refuse all future roads? Do you refuse all future housing estates? Because housing estates have cats. Cats definitely kill bats. But there was a very clear decision in that case by the inspector, because the inspector was asked to consider European court judgments as a basis for decisions about whether the operation of the turbine could be seen as a deliberate act. And more recently, it was an inquiry that was refused on the Isle of Wight. There's been a very interesting section in that particular case study where the inspector has had quite a discussion about curtailment and mitigation and licensing and the ability of wind farms to actually achieve a license for operation if bats are found to be being killed. The implication of it was that actually, no, you just need to keep doing more mitigation. And that, I think, has a very significant impact and significant issues for schemes going forward. The other big issue and the big problem is complete uncertainty about collision risk. Unlike birds, we have no hard and fast way of making assessment of collision risk on bats. We have no hard and fast data on what additive mortality rates bat populations can sustain. But interestingly, most of the debates to date have been about actually, well, you haven't done enough information, you haven't followed appropriate Eurobat survey guidelines. So hopefully the new BCT survey guidelines, whatever you think of them, at least will hopefully put some of this to rest if people are following those. Then much of this debate about survey effort will disappear. But I suspect then it'll all drop onto, the attention will then start moving on to other issues such as collision rate and impacts on species populations. Okay, just a couple more, thank you. In terms of other wildlife issues, very little really to say here. 10 reports made reference to other wildlife issues, 3 related to peats, 5 to badger. None of these were significant issues in the minds of the inspector, and all of them were addressed through condition. So lastly, I would say that impacts on birds and bats do remain the key ecological issues of wind farm inquiries. A lack of appropriate levels of survey and thus unreliable assessment and collision impact are the principal reasons for objection. And ecological issues are still, whilst there's been very few examples I could tell you about that actually ecology was used as a reason for refusal, 81% of the time at public inquiry, ecology issues are raised. Ecology issues are considered a main issue 45% of the time in the inquiries I looked at, and the rest of the time they were third-party minor issues. Only 10% of the time has impacts on bats, and 6.3% has impacts on birds been cited as a reason for refusal. And there are, as I've talked about, a number of regularly occurring issues. Thank you very much.